Motorfest has over 700 cars, so it's no surprise that choosing the right car might be a bit difficult. Combine that with the number of Grand Race routes and the various vehicle classes, and it almost becomes a full-time job trying to keep up with what the best cars in the game are. There are plenty of resources out there, especially here on YouTube, that talk about the Grand Race meta, but it's not just as simple as picking the meta car and calling it a day. There are many factors that go into the best car choice for the race. Let's go! Alright, real quick before we get into it, if you're looking for any of my Motorfest tunes, head to militiagamingco.com, click on Motorfest Pro settings from the top, and there you'll find all of the tunes for all of the cars that I've tested. Alright, let's get into it, man. When selecting cars for the Grand Race, the most important thing to do is to match that car's best qualities with a route that demands those qualities the most. And conversely, you need to avoid picking cars whose weakness is exposed by a particular route. If you get good at solving that equation, you will put yourself in a much more favorable position during the race. So what are we looking for? First, let's talk about the routes themselves. At the beginning of the Grand Race matchmaking screen, you will get a preview of the route. Studying that route will give you a ton of information, but let's not overcomplicate this. What you're looking for on a very basic level is whether or not the route will demand more top speed from the car or more cornering, and if it does require more cornering, do those corners involve gutter turns or is it more city streets? Let's look at an in-depth example. This set of routes is Street 2, Rally Raid, and Racing. I've added text to the map to easily show the vehicle class, but you can identify them by watching the order in which they appear. It will be in the same order as shown at the bottom. Also, these little arrows represent the transitions in between the vehicle types. So, looking at this first section, which is Street 2, you can see that it has a ton of tight turns with almost no long straight sections. Obviously, that's going to require a lot from your car's handling and acceleration, and potentially its ability to gutter. By the way, if you're thinking what's guttering, this guide right here will explain the technique in detail, so check that out after you watch this video if you need to. Now, to know if the route has a lot of gutters, you really just need to start memorizing these routes. I recognize that this route has a ton of gutters when you get through the volcano area, so I decided to select the F40 because it's incredible at guttering and handling. For the Rally Raid portion, it's mostly straights and bombing hills, so the Tacoma is definitely the right choice. However, in this race, I forgot which route this was, and I defaulted to the 959, which doesn't have the top speed of that Tacoma because it's much better at handling. Notice that going into this vehicle change, I have the lead thanks to the handling of that F40, and then the second place person hits the wall in that first turn, which allows me to extend that quite a bit. But if we fast forward to the end of this section, he ends up using slipstream of the third place player to catch back up to me because the 959 just doesn't have the top speed required in this section to defend its position against these two BMWs. Had I been in the Tacoma, I would have easily kept my gap despite the slipstream advantage that they had, because I would have been able to keep a higher top speed than those two slipstreaming. But let's get to the third section of this race. Notice that it's all straights and highways with the exception of the last couple of turns. Obviously, in this scenario, you want a car that's going to have a higher top speed as its main statistic. I correctly chose the Lamborghini Gallardo Super Trofeo. It's definitely the best choice for these highway racing sections. My competition chose the T50, which is a great pick in 90% of the scenarios as it's the best overall racing car. So let's see how this played out in the race. Immediately after the transition, my lack of skill plays a huge factor as I forget the path and have to swing left to stay on the road. Then I enter this highway too fast, which causes me to hit a wall. So already I'm not doing so well, but I stay in slipstream, and I know the final turn is very tight and difficult to pass on, and I also know that my car has a higher top speed. So I decide to make the pass as soon as I can. Because of that higher top speed, I know that he can't pass me on the open highway like this, which means as long as I don't make any catastrophic mistakes, I should be in front going into those final corners, and that makes him have to drive harder and attempt to make a pass. Smartly, he actually decides to take a different path on this bridge, hoping that I tap a wall, but it actually backfires because I don't hit any walls and he actually loses a little bit of ground. Notice his position right before the bridge, and then notice his position right after the bridge. He lost a significant amount of ground, which means he's gonna have to try even harder in these final corners. But like I said, making a pass on these corners is very difficult, and he ends up overshooting a small right, and that ends up being the race. My track position is what allowed me to put pressure on him to race at a faster pace, which resulted in a mistake and a win for me. If we enter that highway and we are both in the same car, the roles would have been reversed because I wouldn't have been able to make a pass. This scenario is actually the perfect example for this video because my car choice ended up being exactly the difference between winning and losing. But this can be applied to literally everyone's race, even if you're not battling for first place. Maybe you're only battling for a midfield position, but it will mean the difference between a top 10 finish or possibly a DNF and not DNFing. Either way, you can see the importance here, so let's talk about the cars themselves. There are 3 different types of cars in Motorfest that are useful in grand races, and then there's everything else. Let's start with the well-rounded. A car that's well-rounded does everything pretty well. It's predictable, it's easy to drive, it's great for players struggling with the car control, but it lacks the necessary speed, power, or handling to be competitive at the higher skill levels. A competent driver in a meta car will always beat one of these cars. A really good example of this type of car is the Bugatti 110. It's fast, but it understeers. It has good acceleration, has good top speed, and it's easy to control, but it just gets eaten alive by the T50 or the Agera R, again, as long as the driver of those cars is competent. Next, we have the high skill meta cars. These are the best cars in the game in each class. They are somewhat difficult to drive at their full potential, but if your skill is high enough, no other cars can really compete with these. The best example of this is the Agera R in Hyper. It's incredibly hard to drive at its full potential, but if you have the skill, there's literally nothing else that comes close in 90% of the routes. There are some special routes though that require a specific car, and that brings me to the final group of cars, which is called the Specialists. These are cars that are at the top of the game at one thing or another, and they're not super deficient at anything else. Usually they have the highest top speed in their class, but they accelerate slowly, or they have the best acceleration, but they understeer like crazy, or maybe they handle the best in class, but they're just way too slow and they can't keep up even on the smallest straight road. These cars might be the biggest difference makers in a nice win if chosen on the correct course, like my Gallardo example, or they can also be the biggest detriment if chosen on the wrong course. Everything else in the vehicle catalog is just not usable and not recommended for the grand races. So the question is, how can you figure out which cars are specialists, high skill meta, or well-rounded? I've created this short list to help you, so go ahead and screenshot that, but if you're really interested in learning, pay attention to the Sweat community, join in my streams and ask questions, send me a DM if you're curious about a specific car's abilities, or do all of the above. Now, I may not know everything about every single car, but I can give you a general idea. Anyways, I hope this list helps, and I hope my example actually shines some light on some things that maybe you just didn't know or didn't think about. But if you still have questions, feel free to send me a DM on Instagram or Discord. I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. I will catch you on the next one. Trigger out.